wasn't about taking the easy path. It's not about only thinking of myself. It's about healing by serving. Whether you're faith-based or not, how we treat each other matters. We can lie about it as much as we like and try to convince ourselves that we're hugely important from whatever title or whatever you've done, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. The connections we have are the most precious things we have in our lives. From my experience, my faith has improved, and so has my outlook looking forward. Finding meaning matters. Caring for people matter. At the same time, they can be one of the most painful things. At the same time, a lot of people I know have been hurt, and I have them on my podcast. They've been in some of the episodes you might have listened. But caring for people matter. It's not to gain elevation in a career or a social standing or even value. In my story, it was just to serve.
So back to what I was saying, there was a few times where I was told some things that were very scary as a young child, and I quickly realized that is not normal. And I don't know how old I was. I must have been about 4 or 5. And I will tell you one thing that was said to me was my biological father asked if he could, that he wanted to marry me one day. And that scared me because I knew that daddies and daughters don't get married. That was a very scary thing to say to me at that time, because I knew that, we don't marry our parents. So I was scared, and there were some things happening in that moment where I just froze and I would leave my body. So that was my response, was to just leave and not be present. That would happen quite often. The abuse, it went on until I was about 13. And then when I was 13, not when I was 13, when I was 11, I was raped by my parents' worker. They had left him to watch us, and that's when that event happened. So there was a lot of sexual trauma that had happened at a very young age for me. It just was very, very traumatic for me.
Well, starting at an early age, I started receiving labels, and at first I found solution in the fact that, like, hey, this is why I am the way that I am. And then there was a ton of stigma around each label, and really learning to make peace is a matter of accepting and then taking responsibility, and then kind of moving past that. That's no longer my identity. It's a part of me, and it gives me a way to help other people navigate through their own challenges. But for a long time, it was really the stigma. My labels are alcoholic, addict, bipolar, clinically depressed, anorexia, bulimia.
Yeah.
The list kind of goes on, and really learning to make peace with those is kind of being able to walk on a recovery journey.
We learn more from our failures than our successes. I just remember back before Florida, how the numbing and avoidance of facing trials and tribulations has really been a setback in my recovery. Now, Riva, what does this quote, say to you, and what do you feel contributed in your first steps to your recovery? Like this ideal of failure versus success. A lot of us get tied up that, but what I find, especially being in recovery, being a peer myself, that we learn a lot more from our failures than our successes.
Well, Robert, let me first say that I have always been a little afraid of failure. I like to do things once and be done with it and move on. So when I say weathering the storm, changing old attitudes and perspectives
Yes.
have helped me change my attitude toward failure and my perspective of making mistakes.
We know that access to care is one of the key impediments to people finding help and getting help. So we've all got to work together on this issue. Now let me tie this up and say that when people work together in community and are accepted and are not ostracized or stigmatized. So when we find that people are able to live in community, they do better, they get better.
So something, like you said, 16, absolutely young. I didn't even have my driver's license yet, and my brother was helping me learn to get my permit, and I was able to drive with him because he was old enough for it to be legal.
Yeah.
And I just cherish those times so much. I didn't realize how those memories, I would just be holding on to them, and really helping me get through my grief was just those memories with him, and me trying to recognize how blessed I was to have him for 16 years,
Yeah.
I knew him my whole life. So, and I knew different versions of him. I knew him as a kid, and then I knew him as a teenager, and then I knew him as a young adult. So I really feel like I lost not just Matthew, but all these different versions of him. And I think that's why when you lose a family member that you've known your entire life, I think it's just such a different type of grieving. And there's no guidebook with loss. We all grieve differently, and there might be a book that tells you, oh, you can do this, you can do that, but it's different for every person, including every member in my family. My grief was different than my mom's grief, than my brother's grief, than my dad's grief, because we all had different relationships with Matthew. So of course mistakes were made for grieving. I didn't always choose the best outlets. But over time, I really learned what works for me, and to ask for help when I need it. There is absolutely nothing wrong with getting help, whether it is reaching out to family and friends or seeking professional guidance.
Was one time, I was helping this incarcerated individual, and I'm busy with things that I think that he needs, because I'm reading the psychosocial and I'm reading the psychiatric assessment, and it's saying that this client has a history of homelessness, and this client have this diagnosis and that diagnosis, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, these are the things I need to help the client get a housing, and I need to do this, and I need to hook him up with a medical provider, and all of these kinds of things. And one day he stopped me and he said, Miss Hunt, do you know what is the most painful and dreadful part of being homeless? And I'm like, oh, you don't have anything to eat, or you don't have, and I'm like reeling off this list of things, in my head of what homelessness entails. However, when I was done and he saw like I looked puzzled and disheveled and, to a point exhausted, he's like, no, he said, loneliness.
Yes.
And I was just stopped in my tracks.
And now as a caregiver, I really needed to learn how to be supportive to him, and the support wasn't going to be me telling him to live his life like I thought he should live it, but it was basically respecting him at where he was at that point, and still loving him and despite. And so I think that is very important as a caregiver, to understand and to know that a quote unquote normal life, or how we feel our loved ones should live, we can't impose our values and thoughts and all on them. We can share, what we feel that we would love to see for them, but at the same time, we have to respect and love them and meet them where they are.
In creating a safe place, because safe place is what we do in our support groups. That's why people talk. That's why people share, because they feel that they're safe. And how important do you think this is? Providing that safe place.
Yeah, I think it's critically important because in my situation, I used to be in the medical field, so it's not unusual for me to talk about things that are, about mental illness, or I don't have any fear of talking about those things. And I've always discussed things like that with my son. So when he was in crisis, I would not be afraid to ask him, are you suicidal? Do you feel suicidal? Do you want to go to the hospital? So he became used to the idea that he could discuss these things with me. And that created, I think, a safe place for him, as well as a safe home. And one thing that I did do a little bit too much because of my anxiety over the situation, I used to ask him every day, are you okay? How are you feeling today? Are you depressed today? And I think it was too much pressure on him, too intrusive. So what I did was I backed off, I stopped asking, and I just said, look, if you need me, I'm here. And you come to me and you tell me if you need something.
I justified everything. Even taking that man's life, I justified it to myself. I made an excuse. I never really held myself responsible or accountable for that. Yeah. And once I was able to do that and break down that barrier of, toughing it out and not showing emotions and, just being cold, once I was able to acknowledge that you were responsible for this, Angel, you did this, nobody else, it kind of like burst open a gate. And I became very emotional. And, because I saw, what I had become as to what God's purpose for me should have been.
And when I found out the next morning, I could just feel my heart and soul just drop.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I was empty. And I couldn't process it. And I just started walking. My friend told me, he said, Brad died last night. And I was like, what did he die from? He said, you don't remember that fight that y'all got into him with? And I said, yeah, he died. What? And I couldn't connect it because it just didn't make any sense to me, because I couldn't believe it. I would never in my life would I imagine that I would inflict harm upon someone, and it wasn't intended. I mean, it was just, I can't even place words around it to explain.
So what I recognized was that if Xander would have lived, I felt that my assignment was to make sure that he was a responsible and purposeful man in his growth.
Yes.
But in his death, my assignment was to ensure that he was as purposeful in his death as he would have been in his life.
Yes.
So we definitely have to be able to recognize that just because you're in a place where you feel like all is lost, you're playing a card game and you're looking like, okay, I have 6 in a possible, and then you and then you mismanage or something happens, and the opposition has something in their hand that you did not take into consideration. Just because you're looking at it as a win-lose situation, it does not mean that you are defeated. It means that the next hand, you have to be a little bit more prepared, or you have to be a little bit more strategic. So my next hand for Xander is to make sure that other women are aware that, hey, this is happening. Hey, you can be an advocate, and it's okay for you to be mad right now, but let's figure out the grand scheme of things. Is how are you going to function after this?
But in my story, it wasn't until my first husband, I call him John in my book, it's a pseudonym, but he goes to rehab for the first time. And when he was there, I visited and attended my very first 12-step meeting. And when he got out, to support him, I started attending the Narcotics Anonymous
meetings. And through the process of attending meetings to support him, I recognized that the 12 steps of recovery, the principles in those steps are applicable to any person with any hurt, habit, or hang up.
Extremely blessed to have a wonderful relationship with her. I appreciate each moment. And part of my appreciation is because I know how things might have turned out very differently. I see that with the loved ones of other people. And so, you know, I have confidence now that if there's speed bumps on our, you know, this road ahead, or even something more serious than a speed bump, that she and we as a family can weather them. I'd say it's been a remarkable turnaround, and I'm so proud of my daughter, of who she is and all that she's accomplished.
Me, if I went to talk to someone about it and work through it, right? And then also seeing others as people that need help and that need community, right? And so whatever they're going through with related to their mental health, not seeing it in such a negative light compared to people that are going through different ailments and things in their physical health. So yeah, I think the first thing that needs to happen is have a better outlook. And the second thing I would just say is kind of what I think the same thing that would happen in the community is trying to find more avenues and opportunities for people that are dealing with mental health issues to find some sort of relief.
In 2004, I had been on so many different psychiatric medications to control the diagnosis, and I was also on Klonopin and Xanax, which are benzodiazepines, for 8 years. So I had this horrible dead feeling inside. I knew that I wanted to die. I was self-harming, and I was afraid I was going to make myself die. I had suicidal ideation. I desired for God to take me, and I didn't want to live anymore. And I knew how dangerous that was. I felt like I was a danger to myself. So in 2004, I asked my psychologist, could I please go inpatient? And she knew that I was ready, and that's what was needed.
I mean, value is key. I mean, if you don't value yourself, it becomes very hard to accomplish anything, really, because most of what we have, but we're devalued all the time by people around us.
Yes.
And, you know, some of us have a harder exterior, you know, some of us can take it a little bit more than others. Some have different coping skills for that. But, you know, growing up, you know, I grew up in a household where everyone just kind of got out what they wanted to get out by shouting it or you know, expressing it. And so I think we were constantly probably shaming each other in some way. Maybe in some levels that brought up some resistance to it, but at the same time, when I reflect back on it, you know, I think I probably was devalued often, and you know, it definitely takes its toll later on in life too. When you look back and you say, you know, can I really do this? Am I really worth it? You know, is this really worth it?
Is when I came home with finding out that Mom had cancer, she told me to not tell anyone.
Yeah.
She hated being the center of attention, and she thought that even though this was stage 4 cancer, she thought that, oh, maybe it's not that big of a deal. Maybe she'll get over it, that she'll become well, and that people will get scared for nothing.
Yeah.
So she did not want anyone to know, and I honored her wishes. And so I was home for, I was home for about the first half, a little more than the first half of 2010, taking care of my sister and my mother, and nobody knew.
10-day break at home, and then go back and do that for 8 months. So after like the third round of that, I just said, you know, this is really getting old, and I feel horrible. I feel so sick, and I was depressed.
Yeah.
And I didn't recognize it at the time, Robert, because I didn't know I was a happy person, you know.
Yeah.
I didn't know what depression was, but I guess looking back, that's what it was. because I was just so isolated from my friends and my family and the things that I hold dear. And I felt so alone, and I just began to cry. And I couldn't control it. It's not because I wanted to cry. The tears just kept rolling uncontrollably down my cheeks. And I literally just emptied an entire box of tissue, like those little tissue boxes they give you in the hospital.
Yeah.
I emptied the whole box, and I just kept, wiping my face. And you can imagine, how I looked. I was bald. I was so weak. I didn't have the strength to take the cap off my toothpaste. My wife had to do that for me. She had to feed me, and I felt like I was so dependent. And I started to pray, and I asked God for his assurance that I would make it through this challenging time of my life. Mm-hmm. And I felt like, God, if you heal me, if you get me through this, then I will testify, and I will share with people what you've done for me so that I can encourage other people to have faith as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm so glad that he did, because I guess at that point, I realized that I was still full of me. I was worried about my appearance. I was worried about my pride, about any negative thoughts that would come into my mind, or even my selfish thoughts. And I just laid it all out before the Lord, and I said, just create a space for you, God, and I want you to fill my heart. I don't want there to be anything left of me. I want my whole body to be filled with you. And one of my favorite verses from the Bible is now Galatians 2:20, which says, I no longer live. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in faith in the Son of God who loved me, and he gave himself for me. And that really just exemplifies what I feel right now.
For me, for the attempts that I've made at my own life. But I think I realized at some point that I didn't really want to die. I just wanted to stop the excruciating pain that I was carrying every day. And I didn't understand why. I felt like my mind had failed me. Like, my mind became my enemy.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to hear that it was, it was a chemical imbalance. I didn't want to hear that, it was, I was predisposition for it because it ran in my family and because of the trauma. I didn't want to hear any of that. I just wanted it to be fixed, and I couldn't fix it. Mm-hmm. And so that was very humbling for me to admit that this was beyond me.
You know your why. Mm-hmm. And when I say know your why is, why do I feel this way? Mm-hmm. And what can I do to help me cope the best way I can?
It wasn't about taking the easy path. It's not about only thinking of myself. It's about healing by serving. Whether you're faith-based or not, how we treat each other matters. We can lie about it as much as we like and try to convince ourselves that we're hugely important from whatever title or whatever you've done. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. The connections we have are the most precious things we have in our lives. From my experience, my faith has improved, and so has my outlook looking forward. Finding meaning matters. Caring for people matter. At the same time, they could be one of the most painful things. At the same time, a lot of people I know have been hurt, and I have them on my podcast. They've been in some of the episodes you might have listened. But caring for people matter. It's not to gain elevation in a career or a social standing or even value. In my story, it was just to serve. In my faith circles, those who know me, I do say this in various different ways, but one of the things I say is we're not owed anything. And some people might say that's pretty depressing. And people right now hearing this will be like, might be getting a little angry, like, how do you know I'm not owed everything? What I'm really saying is that even though those people might be upset or might be like, he doesn't know, and maybe they'll even say, how can you say that? I'm just sharing my perspective, just like anyone else may have their own perspective. But probably you might be listing off the things that you have contributed, the things you have done, and I'm sure they were important. But if you're really being honest, The fact that you're hearing this today, having breath, and are alive today is a huge blessing. Part of my journey of recovery was recognizing the idea of gratitude, and that has been hugely healing in my recovery. We can never repay the people who has helped us in our lives. Our mothers, our fathers, our teachers, our brothers, our friends. In fact, the fact that you weren't thrown away, tossed, or killed, or worse, and you're listening to this today, is a reason to be thankful. I would even argue, even from my perspective, there's always an avenue to be thankful. There's always going to be someone or person or group of people that contributed to where you are right today. Yes, it's never going to be ideal if you continue to compare with other people. But look at where we're at today. Look at how things are today. Never would we imagine that the whole world would stop from something we wouldn't even see. And it humbles us. When I left my previous church, I remember feeling unprepared and lost. A lot of looming questions were floating around in my head. What was the point? And at the same time, I had the realization I didn't have a church to serve in. I remember, I know that some might be listening to this like, well, you could get a lot of things done, but that might be your story, but that's not mine. I remember going to my current church that I am going today, and my friend, Sebastian, I was in the foyer in the church, and I just still remember him taking the initiative to pray with me. I was about to step out that door because that would be easier. You have to understand that church felt painful to me. I could never repay him or the many others who helped me moving forward. There's several people besides Sebastian that were monumental. Just from the current church, Bob, Carice, Sister Small, the choir, just to name a few. Obviously Chantal and some others who spoke to me, Bria, Sid, just to name few. And the ones that I don't mention, it's not that, but all of you were impactful. And then outside the church, Tamika Jones, you have Jessica Daly, who arguably was one of the first podcasts I did. Sebastian was the very first. I remember Morgan, just briefly, and then the people in the past, like my friend from college, Tristan, and Eric, Diana, Tristan's wife. Who else? The doctors, the people who've helped me while I was in New Jersey, people who are helping me today. The support groups, Juan, the Drop-In Center, everyone there. The NAMI group that I'm involved with today. And of course, my dear fiance, Joanne. My point is our connections do matter. And I can never repay any of them. Each of us have more of an impact to each other than we would like to admit. October 2019, I decided to shift over with Revive Ministries to start a podcast. I was scared. I have never done a podcast. There were a lot of struggles, a lot of learning curves at first. But my value and my passion to serve didn't waver. Through my experience and growth in my ministry, I didn't look at the amount of people who listened, or whether they shared what they listened to, or whether it was not about that. I just continued to serve to provide a platform for people to share. One of the things I remember always saying at times in my podcast and in general is that one of the biggest complaints in recovery or people struggling is that they feel they're not heard. In a way, that's what I'm trying to provide. And today, I'm continuing through this situation we're all in. Hopefully, sooner than later, and this will subside. But as we go through this, through this and all that I've talked about from coming to Florida, there was a lot of skills I've grown that I have today. But I will never say I made it. I'll never say I got to where I need to go to. It's just moving forward, continuing to serve, to heal. Because ultimately my serving others became my healing, became my recovery.